more about Prince Harry and his wife Meghan's surprise announcement to step back from their royal duties. Prince Harry defied the Queen when he revealed his plans to pull back from the monarchy. And the Queen said that she'd asked her grandson not to issue Wednesday's public statement, but he went ahead with it anyway. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex say they're working towards being financially independent. That move's dominated the British media. The royal couple are also debuting.
I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow. Throughout her life, Her Majesty the Queen, my beloved mother, was an inspiration, an example to me and to all my family.
Is that if the BBC had properly investigated the complaints and concerns first raised in 1995, my mother would have known that she'd been deceived.
The confirmation did not arrive with spreadsheets or a public audit. It arrived through tightened language, a briefing that stopped short of denial, and a sentence that changed tone halfway through. According to palace-linked sources, Prince Harry was facing a financial exposure described internally as severe. The figure circulating was staggering: $100 million in obligations tied to ventures that promised independence and delivered pressure instead. The response from London was colder than anyone expected. King Charles III declined to intervene. Prince William reportedly refused to authorize any form of rescue. No bailout, no quiet loan, no institutional safety net. Join us as we trace how the palace allegedly confirmed the exposure without accepting responsibility, why rescue was refused, and how a prince who once walked away from royal finances now finds himself confronting the cost of that decision. The shift inside the palace was subtle, but those who watch language for a living noticed it immediately. On a Tuesday briefing in London, aides stopped correcting reporters and started qualifying answers. The wording changed from flat denials to careful distance. When asked about mounting financial pressure surrounding Prince Harry, the response was not no. It was that the palace would not comment on private financial matters. For veteran correspondents, that was the tell. Behind closed doors at Buckingham Palace, a smaller group of senior staff had already been briefed. According to people familiar with the discussions, the figure circulating internally was alarming: $100 million in combined obligations tied to commercial commitments, legal exposure, and lifestyle costs that no longer had an institutional buffer. No spreadsheet was circulated, no memo stamped confirmed. But no one challenged the number either. The confirmation came by omission. Palace communications, sources say, were instructed not to dispute the figure if pressed. The rationale was narrow: denying a number invites proof. Accepting it quietly allows the story to exhaust itself. This was not a public acknowledgement. It was an internal decision to stop pushing back. Harry learned of that decision indirectly. A trusted intermediary relayed that London would not contradict reports of serious financial exposure. According to people close to him, his reaction was not anger at first, but disbelief. He had expected distance. He had not expected silence that read like assent. The difference mattered. In Montecito, the mood shifted quickly. Advisors gathered around a dining table cleared of papers and devices. The conversation turned practical. What obligations were fixed? Which were variable? Which depended on future earnings that were no longer guaranteed? The antagonist in that room was not the palace. It was time. Deadlines do not negotiate with narratives. Meghan Markle joined the discussion later, according to those present. Her concern, they said, was sustainability. Projects had been launched with optimism and long runways. Now the runway felt shorter. She asked whether the palace's silence meant something else. The answer was careful. It meant London would not help carry the weight. Across the Atlantic, palace factions hardened. One camp argued that acknowledging the exposure, even indirectly, risked normalizing the idea that the Crown was monitoring Harry's finances. That precedent, they warned, would be impossible to reverse. Another camp worried that allowing the figure to circulate unchecked would look punitive, especially given the family dimension. The debate grew tense: compassion versus containment. At the center sat King Charles III, briefed with options that were intentionally narrow: authorize a background correction, issue a statement reaffirming independence, or do nothing and allow silence to communicate distance. The decision leaned towards stewardship. The Crown would not assume liability, financial or reputational, for choices made outside the institution. Prince William was consulted and, according to people aware of the exchange, took a firmer line. Any form of rescue, he argued, would undercut the message of accountability the monarchy had spent years reinforcing. Independence had been requested. Independence, in his view, included consequence. Media coverage accelerated once the palace's posture became clear. Analysts spoke about confirmation without comment. Commentators framed the silence as acknowledgement. The figure gained traction not because it was proven, but because no one with authority disputed it. That vacuum did the work. Harry felt the pressure tighten. Friends described late-night calls and early morning recalculations. He had built a life around autonomy. Now autonomy felt exposed. The realization was unsettling. Inside the palace, silence preserved the institution. Outside it, silence magnified risk. By evening, the story had crossed a threshold. It was no longer rumor. It was context. The palace had not rescued. It had not denied. It had stepped aside. And in that step, the stakes for Harry shifted from speculative to immediate, setting the stage for decisions that would test not just finances, but family lines that had already been stretched thin. The numbers were never written on a whiteboard, but everyone in the room understood their weight. What had once been framed as ambitious investment now felt like exposure. Advisors walked Prince Harry through obligations line by line, careful not to dramatize what was already heavy. Production commitments with fixed delivery dates, legal fees tied to ongoing disputes, security costs that do not shrink when attention spikes. The antagonist here was arithmetic. It does not negotiate with intention. The origin of the strain was not a single decision. It was accumulation. Deals signed during a moment of global sympathy. Expectations built on projected output rather than guaranteed delivery. A lifestyle calibrated for continuity of income that proved unpredictable. None of this was scandalous. It was structural. And structure, once set, resists quick fixes. Harry listened more than he spoke. Those present described a man grappling less with regret than with recalibration. Independence had been the goal. Independence now demanded answers. He asked which obligations were immovable and which could be renegotiated. The answers were mixed. Some contracts allowed flexibility, others did not. Time again became the enemy. Meghan Markle focused on sustainability. Friends said her questions were practical rather than emotional. What could be paused without reputational damage? Which partnerships required visible momentum? Whether scaling back would invite speculation. The calculus was unforgiving. Pull back too far and the narrative becomes failure. Push forward too hard and the pressure compounds. In London, palace discussions mirrored that tension from a different angle. At Buckingham Palace, one faction argued that private compassion did not require public rescue. Quiet advice, they suggested, could be offered without financial intervention. Another faction warned that even informal guidance risked blurring lines that had been drawn deliberately. The monarchy had spent years clarifying what it would and would not underwrite. Money was the brightest line of all. The debate sharpened around precedent. If help were offered now, what message would it send to future generations? That independence is symbolic but reversible. That autonomy carries no real cost. Those arguments carried particular weight with Prince William, whose position, according to people briefed on the discussions, was uncompromising. Accountability, he argued, is meaningless if consequences are absorbed elsewhere. The king's advisors framed the choice in institutional terms. King Charles III had inherited a crown already under scrutiny for privilege and spending. Authorizing any form of bailout, even quietly, would undermine years of messaging about modernization and restraint. Compassion could be expressed privately. Financial rescue could not. Back in California, the absence of a safety net became real. Harry asked directly whether London would step in if the situation worsened. The answer, relayed carefully, was no, not publicly. Not privately. The refusal was not framed as punishment. It was framed as consistency. Choices made outside the institution would be resolved outside it. The emotional impact landed unevenly. Friends described Harry as oscillating between resolve and disbelief. He had anticipated criticism. He had not anticipated complete disengagement. Meghan, by contrast, appeared more measured. She had long assumed that independence meant standing alone. The confirmation was painful, but not surprising. Media coverage interpreted the palace's posture in harsher terms. Commentators spoke of abandonment. Others framed it as tough love. The the language mattered less than the effect. The refusal hardened the story. What had been speculation about exposure became a narrative about refusal. Rescue denied is more compelling than rescue never requested. Inside the palace, aides worried about optics. Allowing a prince to appear financially exposed carried reputational risk. Critics would argue that the monarchy was cold. Supporters would argue that it was principled. The institution chose to accept the criticism. Better to be accused of indifference than entanglement. The antagonists multiplied. Deadlines, media, expectations, each fed the other. Harry's advisors warned that any visible sign of strain would invite further scrutiny. At the same time, overperformance risked deeper commitments. The margin for error narrowed. As evening fell, a quiet decision took shape. No appeal would be made. No intermediaries would be sent to test London's resolve. The refusal was final enough to accept as fact. The focus would shift to mitigation rather than rescue. That acceptance marked a turning point. Independence was no longer an aspiration. It was a condition with costs that could not be deferred. The palace had drawn its line. The math remained. And between them sat a family relationship now governed less by emotion than by precedent, setting the stage for a reckoning that would test not just finances, but the meaning of separation itself. The refusal was not delivered in a phone call or a letter. It arrived through a process. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior aides met in a windowed conference room late afternoon, the kind reserved for decisions that are meant to endure scrutiny. The agenda was narrow. Whether any form of assistance, financial or otherwise, would be extended to Prince Harry as reports of severe exposure hardened into accepted context. The discussion split quickly and decisively. One faction argued for limited intervention, not a bailout, but guidance, quiet help with restructuring obligations. Introductions to advisors who understood institutional finance. Their case rested on family, a son under pressure, a brother exposed. Another faction countered with precedent. Any help, even indirect, would be read as rescue. Rescue would collapse the boundary Harry himself had demanded when he stepped away. The antagonist here was not money, it was precedent. King Charles III was briefed on the arguments in sequence, not debate. His response, according to people familiar with the exchange, was measured and final. The monarchy could not be seen underwriting decisions made outside its framework. Stewardship, he argued, meant protecting the institution from liabilities it did not authorize. Compassion would remain personal. Policy would not bend. When Prince William was consulted, his position was firmer. Those present described his view as rooted in accountability. Independence, he said, cannot be symbolic. If it is reversible at the first sign of strain, it is not independence at all. Any assistance would not just help Harry, it would redefine the rules for everyone who follows. The line was drawn without raised voices, but with unmistakable clarity. No loan, no guarantee, no back-channel support that could later be construed as rescue. The palace would not deny the exposure, and it would not mitigate it. Silence would communicate finality. News of that posture reached California through intermediaries accustomed to translating palace language. The message was precise. London would not contradict reports of serious financial pressure. London would not intervene. According to people close to Harry, the effect was sobering. This was not a negotiation. It was an institutional decision. Harry processed the refusal privately. Friends described a mix of frustration and reluctant understanding. He had argued for autonomy and received it in full. The cost was now visible. He asked whether the palace's stance was driven by public optics or private resentment. The answer was neither. It was consistency. Meghan Markle reacted differently. Those close to her said she focused on what the refusal clarified. There would be no safety net, no quiet cushion if projections failed. Planning would proceed on that basis alone. The clarity, though harsh, removed ambiguity. Media coverage reframed the story almost immediately. What had been reported as debt now became refusal. Commentators contrasted father and son, brothers divided by principle. Headlines spoke of cold resolve. The narrative sharpened because refusal implies judgment, even when none is stated. Inside the palace, aides prepared for backlash. They anticipated criticism from both directions. Too harsh for some, too lenient for others. The institution accepted that cost. The alternative, they believed, was worse. Entanglement would blur responsibility and invite future expectations. The antagonists converged. Financial deadlines approached. public scrutiny intensified. Family ties tightened under strain. Harry's advisors warned that the refusal would be cited repeatedly as evidence of abandonment. The palace countered internally that abandonment was a misreading. Boundaries are not rejection, they are limits. As the day closed, the posture held. No leaks softened the message. No anonymous reassurance emerged. The palace allowed the refusal to stand on its own. For Harry, the meaning was unmistakable. Independence was now complete, not just in name, but in consequence. That clarity shifted the story's center of gravity. The question was no longer whether rescue would come, it was how to operate without it. And in that shift, family dynamics gave way to institutional logic, setting up a final act defined not by negotiation, but by adaptation under pressure. By the fourth day, the story had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer framed as a question of whether help might come. It had become an examination of what happens when help is explicitly withheld and allowed to remain withheld. The palace's posture was now understood not as temporary caution but as settled policy, and that understanding reshaped every calculation on both sides of the Atlantic. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior aides convened early, not to revisit the decision, but to anticipate secondary effects. Their focus was reputational containment rather than family reconciliation. Would the refusal be framed as cruelty? Would it reignite older criticisms about detachment? Would it invite comparisons to earlier moments when royal relatives were quietly supported? Each scenario was mapped and weighed. None altered the conclusion. Reversing course would create a far greater problem than enduring criticism. The palace's reasoning was institutional, not emotional. A rescue, even a partial one, would tether the monarchy to financial exposure it did not authorize. It would also send a signal that separation from royal structures is conditional, reversible, when pressure mounts. For an institution built on precedent, that signal would be destabilizing. Once such a door opens, it rarely closes cleanly. That logic was reinforced by King Charles III, whose approach to the crown has consistently emphasized stewardship and boundary setting. Advisors described his position as firm but not punitive. He did not deny affection for his son. He denied the premise that affection obligates institutional intervention. The distinction mattered to him, even if it was invisible to critics. Prince William took an even narrower view. According to people familiar with his thinking, he saw the moment as a test of credibility. If independence is framed as a choice, it must also be lived as a condition. Shielding consequences would undermine the moral authority with which the monarchy asks others to accept responsibility. His stance was not rooted in rivalry or resentment. It was rooted in a belief that blurred rules erode trust. While London solidified its posture, the consequences unfolded more tangibly in California. For Prince Harry, the refusal forced a recalibration that went beyond spreadsheets. Advisors shifted conversations from hypothetical scenarios to immediate execution. Projects were reviewed not for potential, but for viability. Security contracts were scrutinized line by line. Travel schedules were adjusted to minimize cost without signaling retreat. Every decision now carried amplified weight because there was no fallback. Friends described Harry as moving through distinct phases over the course of the day. Initial frustration gave way to focus. Focus gave way to resolve. The realization that no call would come from London did something clarifying. It removed the psychological pause that comes from waiting for rescue. There would be no intervention to anticipate. Planning could proceed without that variable. This shift altered his relationship with risk. Previously, risk had been framed as manageable, buffered by visibility and family ties. Now risk became personal and finite. Exposure was not theoretical, it was operational. The pressure sharpened his attention to detail in a way friends said they had not seen before. Meghan Markle approached the moment differently. Those close to her said she focused on control rather than reaction. She asked what could be simplified. Which commitments required visibility, and which could be fulfilled quietly? How public perception could be steadied without appearing performative? The aim was to signal durability, not distress. Meghan's response was shaped by experience. She had watched narratives spiral before, fueled by assumption rather than fact. This time, she resisted the instinct to counter every interpretation. Instead, she prioritized internal coherence. Stability inside the household mattered more than correcting every headline outside it. Media coverage reflected the shift. The language moved away from shock toward analysis. Commentators began speaking about leverage and sustainability rather than crisis. That transition was subtle but significant. It suggested that the situation was no longer escalating. It was settling into a defined reality. Some analysts framed the refusal as abandonment, pointing to past instances where royal relatives received quiet support. Others argued the opposite, describing the decision as evidence that the monarchy had finally internalized its own modernization rhetoric. The disagreement itself underscored the core tension. Is the crown a family first, or an institution first? The answer, in this moment, was unambiguous. Inside the palace, aides monitored public reaction without alarm. Criticism was expected. What mattered more was the absence of internal fracture. No senior figure broke ranks. No anonymous reassurance leaked to soften the blow. The refusal was allowed to stand on its own, uncorrected and unqualified. That restraint was intentional. It signaled finality. For Harry, the absence of back-channel signals was decisive. It confirmed that this was not a negotiating position. It was a boundary. Friends said the clarity, though painful, removed a lingering uncertainty that had shadowed previous disagreements. There would be no half measures, no conditional assistance. The relationship with the institution had entered a new phase defined by distance rather than tension. That distance reshaped public interpretation of his independence. What had once been celebrated as liberation was now examined through the lens of cost. Freedom, commentators noted, does not eliminate responsibility. It concentrates on it. The narrative matured from sympathy to scrutiny. Meghan and Harry responded by narrowing their public footprint, not disappearing, but choosing appearances with intention. Extravagance, even perceived, would invite criticism. Restraint became a form of messaging. It suggested awareness rather than denial. The palace observed this adjustment with quiet approval. From an institutional perspective, stability without intervention was the ideal outcome. The refusal had not triggered collapse, it had prompted adaptation. That result reinforced the logic behind the decision. As the week progressed, the story lost its edge. It did not vanish, but it ceased to dominate. The figure remained in circulation, referenced as context rather than headline. That transition marked the end of the acute phase. When a story becomes background, it no longer demands response. It becomes part of the landscape. Inside Buckingham Palace, the issue was formally downgraded from active concern to periodic monitoring. This administrative change carried symbolic weight. It meant the institution considered the matter resolved enough to move on. No further action was anticipated. Harry understood the implication. The door he had once assumed might reopen had closed quietly, not slammed shut, but firmly latched. The monarchy would not be a financial partner in his post-royal life. That chapter was complete. Meghan reached a similar understanding. Friends described a renewed emphasis on long-term planning untethered from royal association. The focus shifted to sustainability built slowly, rather than scale achieved quickly. The goal was endurance, not redemption. The antagonists that remained were impersonal and unyielding: contracts, deadlines, public perception. None could be appealed to emotionally. They required management, not argument. This reality reshaped daily priorities in subtle but lasting ways. What did not happen became as important as what did. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public plea, no symbolic reconciliation. The refusal stood without spectacle, which made it more durable. Drama invites revision. Silence invites acceptance. Critics continued to debate the morality of the decision. Supporters praised its clarity. The monarchy itself did not engage. From its perspective, the matter had been decided at the level that matters most. Policy had been applied consistently. Precedent had been preserved. In the end, the story closed not with collapse, but with contraction. Options narrowed, expectations reset. The safety net that once existed as a possibility was acknowledged as gone. Independence was no longer aspirational, it was operational. For Harry, this marked a definitive turning point. He was no longer negotiating the terms of separation, he was living with them. The difference was profound. It stripped away ambiguity and replaced it with responsibility that could not be shared. For the palace, the episode reinforced a hard-earned lesson. Institutions endure by resisting the urge to solve every personal crisis. Distance, though uncomfortable, preserves structure. Structure preserves continuity. This matter without reconciliation or rupture. It ended with acceptance on both sides of a boundary that had been tested and held. Rescue was not denied in anger. It was refused in principle. And in a monarchy built on principle as much as blood, that distinction defines everything. Independence brings freedom, but it also removes the safety net. If you want deeper investigations into royal finance, power, and the quiet decisions made behind palace gates, subscribe, share your view, and join us as we follow the consequences that silence leaves behind.